Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Today is going to be a very different episode. You guys have been asking for this episode for over a year, and I'm just going to be brutally honest with you. I have absolutely dreaded putting this episode together. This is so difficult to talk about, and it is so painful that I just haven't wanted to do it. But I'm only here because of you, and if you want to hear the story, I'm going to tell it. Maybe it'll be good for me. Maybe telling it out loud will bring me some closure on some of these issues. Maybe not. That's the fear. The fear is that talking about some of these things that I've left behind me will reopen old wounds. But I think I'm at a place where I can face those wounds and heal them, perhaps more fully now than I was able to in the past. I've got my blanket here. I've got my tissues. I'm just going to be a little bit more casual with all of this today. This is the story that you've wanted to hear. This is the story of how and why I left the Mormon Church. So let's get into it. As most of you know, I was born and raised a devout Utah Mormon. My great-great-grandfather was Thomas Chamberlain, who founded and settled what is now Kanab, Utah. And he had 6 wives. I am a descendant of one of those wives. Thomas Chamberlain's father came from Bristol, England, immigrating to Iowa, and from there he traveled with the Mormon pioneers across the plains to what became Tooele, Utah. His son, Thomas, was then sent south to settle southern Utah with some other families, and that is how my family ended up here in southern Utah. My paternal grandparents are from Kanab and Orderville, Utah. They were born and raised there right from the Mormon pioneers. My maternal grandmother was also born from Utah pioneers that came across the country on hand carts. My maternal grandfather was on his way to California from Rochester, New York to look for gold, and he ran out of gas and money in Cedar City, Utah, and then he met my grandmother, and that's how he ended up there. My grandparents from Kanab and Orderville moved to Cedar City after they got married, and that's where I was born. I was born and raised the same way my parents were. Mormonism is in our DNA, but I never really took to it. My father graduated from law school at the University of Utah, and very soon after passing the bar, he and my mother moved to Cedar City, Utah. I was born in 1970. My father ran for the position of Iron County prosecutor and got that position. He was county prosecutor for 2 terms, meaning 8 years. During that time, he held many church positions, as did my mother. In Mormonism, you are required to do some type of a job in the church. They're all unpaid jobs. This is in addition to your other duties as church members. I was raised in a household where money was not an issue. We were not rich, but we had more money than most people in our town. My parents built a big house on the top of a hill in Cedar City with only a dirt road going up there at the time. My dad paid $2,000 for the building lot, and my grandparents threw a fit. That was so much money back then. But my dad knew this was going to be a beautiful view lot, and it was. It became a very nice neighborhood. We had a beautiful view of the town and a very nice life. I played with the neighborhood kids and had the idyllic childhood building forts in the vacant lot next door, riding our bikes and then our 4-wheelers, sledding down the steep hill in the winter and going to school. Something that I have since discovered is very unusual. I didn't know it was unusual at the time. Every single night of the week, both sets of my grandparents, my father's parents and my mother's parents, would come to our house for a visit. Every single night they came to our house. I thought it was normal. I thought everybody's grandparents went to their house every night. And I'm so happy. I'm so happy that they did that, because now that they're gone, it means a lot to me. This is going to be a tough one. The only day my grandparents didn't come to our house for a visit every evening was on Sunday. On Sundays, we would go to their house after church, after Sunday dinner. My grandmothers would always have some sort of homemade treat for us. My grandma Lampman always had homemade rice pudding. She made the best rice pudding. And my grandma Chamberlain always had homemade rolls with homemade jam. But Sunday was for church and family. In Utah, there are a lot of Mormons, and so there are several wards that share each church building. One ward goes at 9 a.m., one ward goes at 1 p.m., ward goes at 4 p.m. When I was young, you went to church for 2 hours for one block, and then you would go home for either lunch or dinner for a break. Then you would go back to church for 2 more hours. During that time, you had sacrament meeting, where everyone sits in the chapel for talks and taking the sacrament, which is bread and water for Mormons. And then you split off after sacrament meeting. The young kids go to primary, the teenagers go to young men's and young women's. Back then it was called mutual, and the adults go to Sunday school, and then the women go to Relief Society and the men go to priesthood meeting. When I was 10 years old in 1980, the church noticed that a lot of people were not coming back for the second 2-hour block. So the church consolidated the 4 hours into a block, 1 3-hour block of time. From then until the time I left the church, I went to church for 3 hours every Sunday. Now, just recently, because people are not staying the entire time, the church has changed again, and now church is only 2 hours long. That seems like a cakewalk compared to how I grew up. Sundays were a very different day in the household of a Mormon family. You are not allowed to play with your friends. You are not allowed to exert a lot of effort. You aren't supposed to do physical activities. You can maybe go on a very light walk, but it's not a day for hiking. We were not allowed to ride our bikes on Sunday. We were not allowed to play tennis. My dad eventually built a tennis court across the street from our house. We were not allowed to play tennis on Sunday. And in Mormonism, you are not allowed to swim on Sunday. This is very strange to say out loud. Mormons believe that the devil has control over the water. And so you are not allowed to swim on Sunday because the thinking is that you're more susceptible on a Sunday in the water because the devil knows it's the Lord's day. It sounds very strange to hear that come out of my mouth, but Mormons do believe that the devil controls the water. In fact, missionaries, men and women that are on missions, are not allowed to swim at all because the Mormons believe that the devil controls the water. So Sundays were spent reading the comics. I remember laying on the living room floor reading the comics. We were not allowed to watch TV on Sunday. I would listen to my Walkman if I could get away with that. But basically, we just kind of laid around. We cleaned up after lunch and, maybe read some scriptures. Sometimes we were allowed to do homework, but Sunday was very much supposed to be a day of rest. When I was very little, I did fine at church. I sang the songs and I learned the lessons, and I actually really enjoyed family home evening, which is something that Mormons do every Monday night at home. The family gets together and has a little mini church service with an opening prayer, a song, a scripture, a couple of talks, a closing prayer, and then a treat. And most family members would have a chart rotating family names to see who was in charge of what part of the duties for family home evening. That's what it was called. I don't know if the church still does that. As I got older, I loathed family home evening. It was just a huge hassle to get everyone out of their rooms and make the assignments. And it was just exhausting for the parents too. And that wasn't just for my family. Family home evening was a chore, but there was something else that was starting to go on inside me deeper than not liking family home evening. I was starting to have some real issues that I didn't even understand at the time. In fact, at 54 years old, I am still figuring out some of these issues. First off, I had undiagnosed ADD and mild autism. We didn't even know what those things were back then. I was recently tested for autism. My therapist insisted that I have that done, and I say mild, but I have some very strong autistic traits, and it made my life difficult growing up because we didn't recognize things back then. At about 12 years old, I started getting bullied to the point that I thought about killing myself more than once, more than twice. And then these girls that made my life so miserable want to come on my Facebook, 20 whatever years later, and hey, let's be friends. And it's like, go f yourself. I almost died because of you. It was bad. It was really bad. And then I got a boyfriend. And guess who that boyfriend was? Travis. A lot of you have met Travis, my best friend, on my Patreon or here on the channel. Travis is my best friend and has been for the last 15 or 16 years. We have known each other since we were very little kids. But when we started going together, that was the term. They're going together. We went together. We started going together when we were like 12, and we stayed together till we were 15. That is a long time when you're that age. Now, Travis was from the wrong side of the tracks. He did not have a dad. And back then in rural Mormon Cedar City, Utah, I personally did not know of anyone else, even from a divorced home, let alone someone who did not know their dad at all. So Travis was a bad kid. He was one of the bad kids. And when I started going with him, I think it dawned on me, this is wrong. It's not his fault that he doesn't have a dad. Why are people saying he's a bad kid because he doesn't have a dad? Well, I mean, he also smoked cigarettes and chewed. It was the 80s, man. We had a smoking section at the high school back then. Remember those? But even at that age, I started to think to myself, like, it's not right that people treat him like he's a bad kid because he doesn't know who his dad is and his mom doesn't take him to church. His mom was working all the time. I didn't like that. I didn't like the way he was treated. And that was probably the start of me being self-aware to the fact that I didn't really like a lot of things that everybody else did. I didn't like the way the goody two-shoes kids acted. We called them the God Squad. They were like these uber religious kids and they always acted like they were better than everyone else. And I just absolutely could not stand them. The problem was they were also all the kids that were in choir and, hate to brag, tap myself on the back here, but outside of one other girl who became an opera singer and has perfect pitch, our voices are completely different. I had the best voice in school, so I always got chosen for the solos, and I was one of the most prevalent singers in the choir. So even though I was a cheerleader and then on the drill team and hung out with the popular girls who were actually the mean girls, I was stuck between both worlds because I was also in the choir with the more academic kids. And then on top of that, my mom made me play the violin starting around like 5th grade or 6th grade. So I was also in orchestra. That also put me in proximity with the God Squad. And these kids were not nice. When I look back at these kids now, one of them has died from cancer, but this girl was so mean to me and everyone respected her. She was like this kind of boyish, tall. Everyone thought she was so nice and so sweet. And this girl was so mean to me and so unkind and rolled her eyes at me, made me feel bad about myself all the time. For the most part, these really churchy kids were very judgmental and mean. And because I was also a bad kid, because I dated a bad kid, I was known to make out with boys and hang out with the party kids. The goody two-shoes kids treated me like crap. And this also did not sit well with me. So I took note. Mormons do not equal nice. When I was about 14 or 15, I started to have some real issues at church. One Sunday, they were talking about the first vision. The first vision is the foundational story of the church. Joseph Smith was a 14-year-old boy. He went into the woods to pray. God and Jesus appeared to him and said, "Don't join any of these churches. They're all false." Joseph came out of the woods and started his own church. So we're talking about the first vision one day in Sunday school. And I said, wait a minute. That would be like Sean. And I pointed over to a kid named Sean Williams, who passed away a few years later. I said, that would be like Sean walking up Cedar Canyon, saying that he knelt down and said a prayer and that God and Jesus appeared to him and that all of us are wrong and that he's the only true prophet and then starting his own church. If Sean did that, you would all say he was crazy and you would laugh at him. When I said this in Sunday school, the look on my Sunday school teacher's face, I think that's the first time I saw actual rage. This man grabbed me by my arm and dragged me out into the hall of the church and put his finger in my face and pounded on my chest and called me names. "How dare you, you spoiled little brat, this, that, and the other. How dare you ask those questions? How dare you compare our prophet to Sean? How dare you say those things about our church?" And I stood there with my mouth hanging open and my heart beating out of my chest. I could feel my face getting hot. And I took note. Mormons are not nice. I took note. I am not allowed to speak. I am not allowed to question. And another seed was planted. One Sunday, I want to guess I was maybe 13. I was called into the bishop's office for a bishop's interview. This is something that needs its own episode. And if you want to hear about these interviews, there's a whole movement trying to get these interviews banned. I will make an episode about that. Usually the bishop is supposed to take you in for a biannual interview and ask you about school, ask you about scripture study, ask you if you're living the promises you made when you were baptized. But that is not what a lot of bishops do. I sat in this cinder block room with this bishop, this man from my neighborhood, and was asked whether or not I had ever kissed a boy, whether or not I had ever kissed a boy using my tongue, whether or not a boy had ever touched my breasts, whether or not a boy had ever touched my vagina. That is not the word he used. I'm too embarrassed to say the word he used. And there were other questions as well involving my underwear. Okay, this triggers something so primal in me. When I talk about this shit, it takes me to a place, you hear about people that are sexually abused and they leave their body and they see themselves floating above their body while they're being abused. I can see myself in the room. It's like I'm not behind my eyes. And right now, I'm going to be really honest with you. I am not in a great place emotionally. You guys know I've had a really rough summer. So I'm not going to go too far down this road, because if I do, I'll be in bed for a week, and I can't afford to be in bed for a week right now. I will tell you very honestly, this is just going to be a really blunt episode. I have been raped, and that was terrible. It was awful. For me, what happened to me in that bishop's interview was worse than my rape. That's my personal feelings on it. I have never felt so violated in my life. I have never felt the level of humiliation or total and complete loss of the control over my own body, my thoughts, my mind. I have never felt so embarrassed. I had never felt so small. I felt really, really small. And I don't think I got over that for a long time. And I probably need to stop here on this part of it. I actually called my therapist preparing for this episode, and she told me not to get too deep into this part because there are some other things that happened, and when I talk about them, it destroys me for a long time, and I just can't afford that kind of emotional. I can't have it right now. I'm already dealing with too many things. But when I tell you that this was a life-changing experience for me that left me feeling dirty and disgusting, I could not look at myself in the mirror for weeks. I could not look at myself getting in the shower. I felt so viciously violated. And I took note. Some Mormons are perverts. When I found myself pregnant at 17 years old in the winter of my senior year at high school, and I had to go tell each teacher that I was dropping out of school, the non-religious teachers hugged me and told me they would miss me and that they wished me well. The religious teachers looked at me with disgust and told me I had ruined my life. One teacher actually said, "I always knew you'd end up a nobody. What a waste." That same day I went home, and the entryway of my house was full of flowers sent to my mother by her friends, as if I had died. And I took note. I'm a slut that brought shame to my family. I wasn't doing anything all the other girls weren't doing, but I happened to get caught. A year later, after I married my kid's father and everyone assumed we were going to go to the temple, I knew my ex-husband was not temple material. He'd not even been in church for years, although he was baptized as a kid. But the church pushed us through and we went to the temple anyway. They warned us. My father tried to handle it with humor. Before we went into the temple, the Mormon temple is the highest level of Mormonism. My dad said, if you see pizza dough flying around in the air, don't be surprised. And I thought, what in the world does that mean? So I went into the temple. They separate the men and the women. At 18 years old, I was asked to get naked. A sheet with a hole cut in the center was draped over my body with my head sticking out. 4 little old ladies entered the room, the very dimly lit room with fancy crystal wall sconces, and they dipped their fingers into oil, and then they reached under the sheet and dabbed the oil on different parts of my naked body. I was mortified. I was terrified. It felt wrong. It felt weird, and I hated it. Then I entered through the women's locker room into the session room. The women and the men always stay separated. This is the, nicely decorated room with a mural. And I looked across the aisle between the chairs and saw all the men on the other side of the room. My husband was there looking completely bewildered, but you're not there with just your husband or whatever. There's all kinds of people doing a session. I'll talk more about that. I don't have time to go into the temple stuff today. This is already going to be a long episode. So if you want a temple thing, then just let me know. The session began and it seemed to last forever. They show you a movie, and the movie used to be like an hour and 20 minutes long. It's about how the Garden of Eden, the beginning of the world, Eve eats the apple, and then the devil comes. And the Apostle Peter in the film is played by Gordon Jump, the guy from WKRP in Cincinnati. And he comes on the screen and I'm like, what is he doing here? But, nobody moved. Nobody said anything. No one spoke. It was deathly quiet. All these people had been to the temple before. It wasn't their first time. They knew what to expect. And then after the movie, the ceremony begins. Everyone is dressed in total white clothing, white socks, white house slippers, white ties for the men. Everything is white suit coats, everything is white. And then you're given this little packet of clothing. So after the movie, this man stands at an altar and he tells you to stand up, and then there's instructions and you start to put on different pieces of this costume. I had no idea what he's doing. He said, take out your aprons and you tie this green thing around your waist. My mom helped me with mine. You have to put a sash on first. You have to tie it on one side and then you take it off and then tie it on another side. So you're just in there changing clothing around. And you're in these little folding chairs and it's tight, and I could just feel my heart pounding and my face was hot. And then they tell you, women, veil your faces. And then you pull this veil out of the thing and you put it on your head, and then you pull the veil down so your face is completely covered. They should prepare you, is what I'm saying. Then the men put on these hats. I mean, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but they are the dumbest looking hats you've ever seen. And that's what my dad's joke about the pizza dough was. They look like some kind of a floppy baker's hat. I mean, this is a picture you can see here. My husband looked ridiculous. I'm not going to lie. I've never been more unattracted to him than in that moment. And when this was all over with, we got our daughter sealed to us. So they bring in my 9-month-old baby, and there's an altar, and you kneel at the altar to seal your family, and you have to be touching. So a temple worker is forcing my 9-month-old's hand on top of our hand, and she's screaming her head off. And they force her and hold her there for like 10 minutes. And I just thought, is this really necessary? After it was all over with, I think we went to dinner, and then my husband and I got in the car and just drove home in silence. And he went in the bathroom and he took his suit off and came out in his new garments. He's wearing garments, Mormon underwear for the first time. And he got in bed and he looked over at me and he said, I'm never doing that again. Don't ask me to. And he literally rolled over and went to sleep, and we never talked about it again. My ex-husband never went back to the temple. He wore his garments and I wore mine. I got pregnant again in 1991. In 1993, for a third time, I was now 23 years old and I had 3 kids under 5. We built a house. I was miserable. We started fighting regularly. My son's first birthday party was the beginning of the end. Our family members were all out in the living room at a birthday party, and my ex-husband and I were fighting in the study. We were not a good match. I wasn't right for him. He wasn't right for me. It was no one's fault. But I decided to leave him. And when I did not go about it the right way. I met someone else. He was a crazy musician, and I kind of lost it. I was free for the first time in my life. I went from my parents' house to my ex-husband's house. He's almost 7 years older than I am. He was more like my dad than my husband. I never made my own choices. He decided how the money was spent, what we were going to do on the weekends that always involved his sports and me just tagging along. And when I left him, it was my first taste of actual freedom. I dumped my kids on him and on the babysitters. I spent money on clothes. I ran away on the weekends to this other man's apartment. I was gone too much. I missed time with my babies that I cannot get back. I was just too young. I didn't know how precious those moments were. And there's nothing I can do to ever get those moments back. And I regret that more than anything I regret in my life. I was a good mom, but I ran away on the weekends and I should have been with my kids. I didn't run away every weekend. It was only sometimes, but for a few months there, I was just gone too much and my kids needed me. They were really little and I was like a wild animal that had been let out of my cage for the first time. And it felt so good. I couldn't stop myself. This is kind of why I didn't want to tell this story because I really can't control my emotions. And I'm sorry. I know it's uncomfortable to watch somebody cry. But if I stop and start, I'll never get through this. So I'm just going to do my best, okay? I drank wine. I learned to play the guitar. I fought with this other man violently. It's a wonder neither of us ended up in jail. I moved out from my husband's house. I got wow, that was a Freudian slip. My husband's house. See, it was never even my house. I got my own apartment and then I realized I was very lonely. I missed my family. I still had my kids, more than half the time. But I missed my ex-husband. This is really weird. I didn't miss the marriage, but I missed my family. If that makes sense? I'm sure that makes sense to a lot of you. And I wanted my family back. I just didn't want to be married to him. So about, 6 or 7 months after I moved out, we started talking again. And then I moved back home. We went to therapy and he promised things would be different. He promised he would remember my birthday. He promised he wouldn't golf every single day after work. And he promised he'd come home before 9 o'clock at night and he'd help with the kids. And maybe he would take me somewhere instead of going everywhere with his friends. He apologized for not even coming to the hospital to spend time with me after I had my babies. I was very angry about that, especially when I found out other women's husbands would literally come sleep at the hospital and I think my husband stopped by once and brought me a frozen yogurt. And when he came by, he had a friend with him. He's a good person. I'm not trying to run him into the ground. This is my story, okay? This is my story. So I moved back in. He promises things are going to be different. And then our 10th wedding anniversary came and went, and he did not so much as buy me a card. Not a flower, not a note, nothing. And I knew this is who this person is, and he is never going to change. The day after that, I got dressed up and I went to the local bar for South Park night. This was when South Park was a really big deal, and our local bar, the bowling alley, would play episodes of South Park. And I walked into the bar, and sitting there at the bar was the crazy man that I had dated while I was separated. There was his upstairs neighbor, the upstairs neighbor that I had always had a crush on, standing there with his long blonde hair down to his waist, having a beer with one of his buddies. And I went home with him that night. That's my story. It was really fun when we were Mormon and people would be like, let's sit around the table and talk about how we met. We met at BYU. We met on our mission. Oh, we hooked up after a night in a bar. My marriage was over, and I knew it. Who was the upstairs neighbor, the man that I hooked up with? My husband of the last 24 years, Jason. I didn't even get to date. Jason ruined everything. I had plans to leave my ex-husband, to be single, to live the life, and Jason ruined it all. I had no intentions of falling in love with him. In fact, there were moments that I was just like, ew, because he did some things that I didn't really like. I didn't really like the way he talked about women at times. He's come a long way. But, it was what it was. And I fell in love and I never got to date. So I moved out of the house for a second time. I went to my bishop and I asked for a temple divorce because you see, In temple marriage, the woman is sealed to the husband, and I was appalled to learn that my husband had to sign off before I was granted a temple divorce. My husband had to approve the temple divorce. I had no say. He had all the say. And I took note. The Mormon Church sees women as second-class citizens. Jason and I married in 2000 in a civil ceremony. We weren't worthy to go to the temple because we had been living in sin. And so we had a beautiful civil ceremony. And then about 5 years later, we got to the temple classes. We went to church most of the time when we were married, but we would always have these weekends where we would leave town and maybe have a drink or two. We just were not meant to be Mormon, and that's okay. Neither of us really liked church. We went because we thought it was good for the kids, but I'm going to be really honest with you, and this is very important. We saw how non-Mormon kids were treated when we were growing up, and we saw how non-Mormon kids were treated when our kids were little. And we did not want our kids to be the bad kids. So we took them to church so they'd fit in. Their father never took them. So my kids grew up only going to church about 70%, 60% of the time because they were with their dad on some weekends and he didn't go to church. As the kids got older, we went to church a little less. We'd all go for the first of the 3 hours. We'd go to sacrament meeting where everyone's together. And then when that meeting was over and you split to go to different rooms, we would make a plan to meet up in the parking lot, slipping out kind of one at a time so no one would notice we were all leaving and try and get us to stay. Yes, Mormons actually do that. We would pile into the car, we would rush home and change our clothes, and then we would go to Red Lobster. That was like our Sunday place. And it was really quite expensive. I'm not really sure how we ended up at Red Lobster because it was, always at least back in the 90s, the early 2000s, it was at least $100 to take 5 people there. So I'm not really sure why we always went there. I mean, $100 now is almost nothing, but some weeks we would stay for the whole 3 hours at church, but a lot of weeks we wouldn't. The kids hated the weeks when I made us all stay. But I tried, you guys. I did. I wish I felt the peace some people feel at church. I wish I felt the connection that people talk about. I wish I believed in the stories, but the truth is I never did. From the time I was a young girl, I knew this is all a story. These are all a fairy tale. It's a fable. I liked the peace that the story brought me. If I did this, I would get that. If I did this, I was promised that. I liked that. And I wanted so badly to be one of the people that believed it because they seemed so detached from the horror of real life. And you have to remember, I'm a professional singer. So all this time I'm singing in these dingy bars and dealing with these skeezy promoters and then going to church on Sunday. And these women didn't live that life. They baked bread and maybe they were a receptionist in an office. They didn't live in a dirty, dingy bar and then go to church on Sunday. I remember one time I played in a place that was really smoky. This was before they outlawed smoking. And we would take all my instruments and lay them out on the lawn to air out the cigarette smoke. And one of my neighbors came by and was just so disgusted at my lifestyle. And I just remember thinking, mind your own business. But people don't, I just always felt so looked down upon. I really did. Now, if you ask Mormons, they will tell you, if they're watching this story right now, Mormons will say, she didn't pray enough. Well, you know what? I prayed 3 times a day. To that, they'll say, she didn't pray in earnest. I did. Then they'll say she didn't read her scriptures. I read them every day. To that, they'd say she did not search, ponder, and pray with an open heart. I searched those scriptures until my heart broke, and I never felt it. I never felt it because I have a very odd talent for sniffing out the truth, and I didn't find the truth there. I can tell when someone is lying, and I can tell when someone is faking it, and I know a fable from a mile away. Throughout my time as a singer, I got a little bit of notoriety. I was handpicked by Sarah McLachlan to join her on the Lilith Fair tour. After the Lilith Fair tour was over, you might have to look that up if you're not my age, I played with artists like Sean Colvin and Lisa Loeb, the Cowboy Junkies, Paula Cole, Joan Jones, Fastball, Tonic, Better Than Ezra, Duncan Sheik, and lots more. Jars of Clay. I don't know. I can't remember everybody, but I got offered a record deal by Third Rail Records, which was then a subsidiary of Hollywood Records. And I sat in an office building down in Los Angeles, getting ready to sign this $500,000 deal. And I asked for a moment, and I called my bishop. And he told me, how are you going to be a good Mormon if you sign this record deal? How are you going to be a good mother? And I felt the guilt, and I felt that I would never, ever be viewed as a good Mormon or a good mom if I took this record deal. And so I walked away. And it was the single worst decision I've ever made in my life. And I made that decision based on another man's opinion, a man who barely knew me and has no impact on my life whatsoever. That's how brainwashed I was. That's how indoctrinated I was. The church people loved me for it. When I'd go to church on Sunday, the bishop would say, there's our rock star. They tried to like me, but they knew I was a square peg in a round hole. They talked Jason and I into taking the temple classes to get us prepared to go through the temple. I had my endowment, they call it. That's what happens the first time you go to the temple with the washing and whatnot. Jason had never been, so we took the classes. And then I was told that I would be forced to go through a bishop's court before I would be back allowed in the temple. Why? Because I had had sex with Jason while I was still legally married to my ex-husband. It didn't matter that Jason had done the same. It only mattered for me, the woman. And I took note. The Mormon Church is misogynistic. What is a bishop's court? You sit there before 3 neighborhood men, the bishop, his first counselor, and his second counselor. They listen to your sins, and then they judge you, and they judge what your punishment should be. I was actually really hoping they would disfellowship me so I could stop going to church for a while, but they didn't. They put me through the humiliating 6-week-long process and then told me not to take the sacrament for a month and to read the Book of Mormon again. When the horrific, embarrassing ordeal was over, I was told that I had been cleansed of my sins and that I would never, ever have to talk about them again, not even on the day that I met the Lord, because I was forgiven. I had divulged all of my deepest, darkest secrets to these 3 strangers, and I was absolved, and I would never have to talk about it again. And that was a lie. Before I could marry Jason in the temple, I had to get approval from another man, an attorney here in town that did not like my father because he was jealous of my father. This man wanted to be the judge, but the governor appointed my father and not him to be the judge. Did I have any idea that this man hated my father? Absolutely not. So I go walking into this interview with my stake president thinking this is just a formality. I've been through the humiliating bishop's court and my sins have been forgiven. And that is far from what happened. The second this man found out who I was, he informed me that we would be meeting alone for the next 8 weeks every Sunday night. For the next 8 weeks, I left my family at home and was forced to go into this man's office, he and I alone, and relive every single detail of my sexual life. Before I married Jason, after I married Jason, and I'm going to get pretty graphic here because I am not ashamed of what was done to me. This man should be ashamed. I was forced to sit in this small, stinky office with this gross old man with bad breath and a cheap suit while he asked me how many times I had performed oral sex on my husband, what sexual positions did I prefer, and from time to time he would laugh and say, "Oh, your dad must have just loved that," when I would tell him of some of the things I had done and that people knew about. I was forced to discuss my personal sexual life while this man sat and fondled his penis under the desk. This man sat and asked me questions about my sex life while he played with himself. And I knew he was playing with himself. And I was forced to sit there and watch this and endure it
week after week after week, and I will never not be angry about what happened to me as a little girl and what happened to me as an adult. I was sexually abused within the Mormon Church, and no one will ever stop me from talking about what happened to me. I sat there traumatized all over again, taken right back to the place I was at as a little girl when I was first abused inside the Mormon Church. I could not believe this was happening again. But you see, I deserved it. This was my punishment. Had I not done these things, I would not be required to talk about these things. Do you see how insidious this is? One Sunday at dinner at my parents' house, I said to my dad, I'm confused. I thought when the bishop's court was over, I would never have to talk about anything that I had done again. And he said, you won't. And I said, Dad, this guy, and I said his name. I've really thought about whether just saying his name or not, and I may at some point. I said, he's made me go over every single detail, like in great depth for the last 8 Sundays. My father stopped eating. He put his fork down and went into his bedroom. And the next thing I heard, the man had been relieved of his position as stake president. So the church did the right thing, but my father doesn't know what that man did to me in there. I'm not going to sit and talk to my dad about some guy playing with himself. And I took note. Mormon men in positions of power are very often perverts. Jason and I continued on. We went through the temple. Jason handled it better than my ex-husband did. We wore our garments. We stopped having cocktails. For 7 years, we didn't have a drop of alcohol. We started going to the temple once or twice a month. But something inside me was growing, and it was different this time. It wasn't the usual questions about the first vision or the fact that I don't like a lot of Mormons. I don't think some Mormons are very good people. There are Mormons that are very good people, and there are Mormons that are not good people. But if God runs the church and if God decides, then why are bad people put in positions of power? If God is calling these people to these positions, why are bad people in these positions? That doesn't make any sense. The issues that I was having now were not as shallow or surface. They were doctrinal. I was being lied to, and I couldn't stomach it anymore. I got into my mid-30s. Jason and I started to talk about all the things we hated about the Mormon culture. Jason has never really been a full believer. He wanted to be accepted. He wanted my parents to accept him. He was raised by semi-active parents. He went to church about 30% of the time growing up. He went to church because I wanted him to. In the ex-Mormon community, there is something called a shelf. Mormons who have questions use this metaphor to explain what happens. You have questions about something in the church. There are no answers for that question, or you are not allowed to ask that question. So you take the issue and you put it on a shelf. Another issue comes along that you're not allowed to question, or there are no answers for that question. So you take that issue and you put it on a shelf. And over time, for people who end up leaving the church, the shelf gets too heavy and there are no more room for the issues on the shelf. And then the shelf breaks. So when Mormons talk to other Mormons, you will hear them say, "What broke your shelf? What was the thing that broke your shelf?" For so long, I had taken my issues and put them on the shelf, taken the issue and put it on the shelf. And then it happened. It's 2008. We are sitting in what is called a joint meeting. Instead of having the women go to Relief Society and the men go to priesthood, we were all in one room. The bishop comes in, and following him is one of his counselors pushing a dolly, like a moving dolly. And on that dolly is a stack of yard signs, you know, those metal yard signs that you put in your lawn. And the bishop started to talk about this thing called Proposition 8. And I didn't understand. I didn't know what Proposition 8 was, and he was talking about it being something on the ballot in California.
I was never involved in politics. I didn't know what things like this were. If you don't know, Proposition 8 was a proposed new section of the state constitution of California that would ban same-sex marriage. California was the first state to ever have the issue on the ballot. It was a big deal because if California went with same-sex marriage, then they knew other states would follow. So I was sitting in this room in this meeting and feeling very confused. Why was my bishop talking about politics? I was always told that there was a very strict rule. The Mormon Church does not get involved in politics. And I could feel my face start to get hot. This was against the rules that I had so diligently tried to follow despite hating them all and giving up everything, including a record deal. And now here stood my bishop breaking this cardinal rule. It was bad enough that my church called all my gay friends sinners. And it was bad enough that my church treated gay people like crap. Now they're going to bring up banning gay marriage at my church. I was sitting there and I had my quad open. A quad is all 4 books Mormons use in one: the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Doctrine and Covenants. It's a thick book because by the time you get the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, it's a big, thick book. And we call it a quad because there's 4 books in it. And you get your name engraved on it and, you mark it up, you highlight the scriptures you like, you make marks, dog ears on the pages, whatever. So I had my quad open on my lap. And I even remember what I was wearing. I was wearing this tan jersey skirt, jersey materials, kind of like a stretchy cotton. And it was a light tan. And I was worried. I was getting so angry. I could feel the sweat rolling down my back. And I knew that when I stood up, I was going to have sweat marks, on my butt and between my legs because I was getting so sweaty. And I just couldn't wrap my head around what was happening. Why was my bishop standing here talking about politics? And then the ball dropped. The bishop said that the church leaders were asking that each and every active member of the church put one of these yard signs in their yard that said, vote for Prop 8 in California or vote no on Prop 8. I can't remember if it was for or against. But even though this was in Utah and the proposition wasn't even on the ballot here, we were being asked to not only get involved in politics, but we were directed to get involved in politics. In California, we were being asked to show our support for the banning of gay marriage so the newspapers would pick it up, so the media would pick it up, and California Mormons would see Utah Mormons, we're considered the most devout. Utah Mormons were backing them up on voting against gay marriage. My church was asking me to vote against the right of my gay friends to marry. I could feel my blood start to boil. I have a temper now. Back then it was much worse. I've worked very hard on my temper. I could feel that tickling sensation you get in your stomach when you're losing control of your emotions. I could not believe this was happening. And I stared at my bishop, and as he was talking, his eyes caught mine for a second. And when they caught mine, it was kind of like scanning the room, catch my eye. And then he kind of did this, like I must have had this look on my face. I am not good at hiding my emotions. And I remember him going like this when he saw my face and he knew he had lost me. And I kind of saw the color drain from his face. He started to stumble over his words. This was a nice man. I liked this man. He was probably prepared for a strong reaction from a few other people, but the other way. Overly enthusiastic homophobic members that would blow this up. And he didn't want that either. You could tell he was nervous about this, but he had been directed to do this and he was doing what he'd been told to do. You do not question the leaders of the church. So my bishop continued to speak and then he said it. Brothers and sisters, our church does not support homosexuality and it will never support gay marriage. That was it. That was the moment. I can so vividly picture this moment. It was late afternoon. The sun was streaming in through a skinny window that had a doily, lacy curtain over it. And it smelled bad in there. Too many people in one room. And I could see the little sunbeams, the flecks of dust in the sunlight streaming in. And everything kind of started to go into slow motion. And
I think I might have been holding my breath. I was done. I was done with it all. And my brain completely shut down and my body took over. I don't know if you've ever experienced that or not, but I went on autopilot. It was the strangest sensation. I remember my left hand coming up and over my lap and slamming my quad shut so hard it made everyone in the room jump. I snatched my books off my lap and stuffed them into my church bag that was sitting on the floor. And then I ripped the bag up off the floor and swung it over my shoulder, hitting the man's arm that was sitting next to me on my right. Jason was on my left. And I stood up in the middle of the bishop talking, and I stared at him for just a little bit too long. And I felt Jason standing up slowly behind me. I mean, Jason knows me really well. And I remember I looked to the people in the row next to me on my right, and I just said, move. And I remember them looking up at me. I remember who they were. I remember what they were wearing. And they moved their knees to the side, and I spun around on my heels from facing the front to the side, and I stormed past them, and I walked out of the room with Jason hot on my heels. I made it a point to slam the door behind me when I walked out of the room, and I never went back. That was my last day in the Mormon Church. We walked to the car. Jason did not say a word. He knows when I'm quiet, I'm dangerous. When I'm really quiet, that's when I'm really upset. And the next Sunday rolled around and he said, "Are we going to church?" And I said, "No, we are not." The Sunday after that came and he asked again. And I said, "No, we're not going. You can go if you want." After a month, he stopped asking. Calls came flooding into the house. The Relief Society president kept coming by. I didn't answer the door when she did because I didn't want to be rude. I was scared that I might unleash on her, and I didn't want that to happen. So I just didn't open the door. I got a letter from the bishop. I tore it up. I was done. It was over for me. And that is when the real terror started. What happened next is very difficult for me to explain because a lot of the things happened at the exact same time. And a big part of this story is one that I cannot tell because I do not have permission to tell it. It involves an immediate family member and an ex-family member who is now in prison and has been there for 15 years. Yes, I have a family member by marriage who has been in prison for 15 years. And part of the story of why I've never gone back to church has to do with this part of my life story that I cannot tell. I value my relationship with my immediate family member, and until I have their permission to tell this story, I can't, which makes this part of the story very difficult. So what I will say is this. For the next 3 years, my husband and I left our jobs at the law firm we worked at because of this situation I can't talk about. And we opened our restaurant in 2009, and then the crash hit. We stayed open as long as we could. By 2011, we knew we had to close. No one in the construction-oriented town that we live in was going out to eat because no one was building anything. The mortgage industry had collapsed. St. George, Utah was a ghost town. Our restaurant went from 150 covers on a Friday, Saturday night, 180 covers to 5 or 6. No one had any money. No one was going out to eat. So we closed Haven, our restaurant, and Jason moved to Minot, North Dakota to work in the oil fields as a salesperson of downhole drilling tools. And I stayed here in St. George and went crazy. I had lost my religion. I had lost my faith. I had lost my restaurant. I had lost one of my siblings for a while. I'd lost their husband at the time that was now in prison. And the entire town was talking about our family. My parents went through hell, and I started to drink. And I drank, and I drank, and I drank. And then I discovered Facebook, and I reconnected with old friends, and those friends were in the same boat as us. They'd lost their house, their business, their construction equipment, and they were flat broke. So we drowned our sorrows in alcohol, and we went out 3 nights a week partying. And I would go back and forth to see Jason in North Dakota. He'd come home for a week. I'd go back there for a month. And this went on for a couple of years. We almost got divorced. I hated him for a while. He hated me for a while. I dumped the restaurant on him when I was nuts. It was awful. Our business partner had gone to prison and left us with the bills. We were in dire straits. And I was convinced that this was all because I had stopped going to church. You see, God was punishing me. And so I drank some more. Jason got transferred to Midland, Texas. We did not like it there. He got laid off about 8 months after we were moved, and we took the severance package and moved to Austin and partied for a year straight. We went to great concerts. We went to great shows. I painted every day. I'm an oil painter. I did some of my best work. I got my work in a gallery. My paintings sold for a lot of money. I was performing in very famous places in Austin. I was playing with some of the best musicians in the world. I was loving it. And then I got really homesick. I missed my family. I missed seeing my kids all the time. They were adults now, but I still saw them even when they were away at college, at least once a month, maybe twice a month. And I started to finally sober up, and then things got the worst that they'd ever been, because without all the alcohol, I realized what I had lost. And I would sit on my balcony in Austin on South Lamar and look downtown and cry for hours. My uncle died. He was an alcoholic, and he was the black sheep of the family. My family, who I barely heard from in Austin, called to tell me that they were having a funeral in the Mormon Church, and I lost my mind on them. This uncle hadn't stepped foot in a church in 40 years, and with the crisis I was going through, I felt it was very disrespectful to bury my uncle, to have my uncle's funeral in a church that wouldn't have him. They fired back at me, and then they quit talking to me, and I quit talking to them. And I decided it was time for me to dismantle the mess that my life had become. And so I went down what is called in the ex-Mormon community the rabbit hole. I started reading everything I could get my hands on about Joseph Smith. I found out he had been arrested 42 times. He was a charlatan and a liar. I found out he told not the version of the first vision that we teach in church, but multiple versions, and none of them are the version they teach at church. Joseph Smith told a version where he saw a pillar of fire. Then he told a version where it was just God that appeared to him. He told a version where it was an angel. Oh, wait, no, it was a pillar of fire and God. He told 10 or 12 different versions of the first vision, and none of those are the version they teach in church. I dug deeper. I thought, this can't be right. And I found the backing documents to prove all of this. I found the personal handwritten accounts of people that barely knew each other that matched up, that knew Joseph Smith, and he had told these different stories to different people. I started looking into the prophets of the church, and what I found was white supremacy, misogynism, and a lot of lying. One prophet said men lived on the moon. Another said Native American skin would turn white if they became Mormon. Another prophet said the dinosaurs were actually dragons. One prophet said we'd never walk on the moon because the Lord didn't intend it to be so. And another prophet says Bigfoot is Cain from the Bible. And it goes on and on and on. These are men that I was taught were divinely called of God, and they were full of shit. I learned that the Book of Mormon taught me the Lamanites, which were the darker-skinned people from the Americas, they were brought here with Jesus when Jesus was resurrected from the tomb after his crucifixion. Those people became the Native Americans. That's what I was taught my whole life. And then I learned that is a lie. Anthropologists have tested all of the DNA from every Native American tribe, and none of them are descendant from the Middle East. They are descendant from Asia, and there is no way around it. It's just a lie. Then I learned that the Book of Mormon, that includes stories about horses, could not have horses in those stories because horses did not exist on this continent until the Spanish brought them here in 1519. That is a proven scientific fact. And the Book of Mormon claims horses were here in 400 AD. I learned that this great war that supposedly took place in what is now the Midwest never happened because you see, wars, no matter how long ago they happened, leave artifacts. And there are no artifacts because there was no war. I could go on and on and on about all the things I learned that are lies, but that isn't really what mattered. I could talk about things that were taught to me since the time I could walk. For everything I've told you here today, there are 10 additional reasons for each of the ones I've mentioned. This was my life. I cannot squeeze my lifetime of experiences into one episode. From about 2013 to 2016, my relationship with my parents and sisters was not good. I was going through something they could not understand, that they did not want to understand. They did not want to talk to me about it. They thought I was so very in the
wrong. And in some ways they still do. But I'm a lucky one. My parents still talk to me every day. They still love me, and they are true examples of Christ-like love. Many people in my position lose their families. So I wonder where God lives in that. When you lose your family, when you leave the church, that is not something godly or Christian. If you would like me to do a part 2 on this, there is a lot more to this story. I will. But to be very honest with you, I am feeling extremely spent right now, and this is a good stopping place. This episode's longer than normal, and I'm exhausted. It's 2:30 in the morning, and I have just had a hell of a week. So I'm going to stop here for today, but I'm happy to go into more detail about the CES letter. You can look that up, about the charity work that saved me, about what I learned about this period of time and have learned since. I'm an open book. I hope my story helps someone else. And if you're Mormon and this episode has upset you, I would ask you to remember something. I have been where you have been. I know what you know. You have not been where I have been, and you do not know what I know. Leaving the Mormon Church almost killed me. It damn near killed me, and I will always be angry about that. I was born into something I never agreed to be a part of. It affected every aspect of my life, and it went against my very nature to try and squeeze myself into a place I did not belong for many years. I was so unhappy, and now I'm not. I hope you can celebrate that for me, even if you disagree. I had to claw my way out of a deep, dark hole to get where I am today. And if you are in that deep, dark hole now, just know that even though you might not see it now, keep climbing. Because at the top is the brightest light you've ever seen and the sweetest air you've ever breathed. And what waits for you at the top of that hole is the rest of your life as a free person who can live however you choose. And if there is a God, don't you think that's what he would want for you? I'm just going to end the episode by saying thank you if you're still here. I love you guys, and I appreciate you. And thank you for the opportunity to share my story. Bye.